Anthony had worked the night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital for 5 years. It was a quiet job, most nights uneventful. His duties were simple: patrol the long, dimly lit hallways, monitor the security cameras, and ensure that the emergency exits were locked and secure. There were other guards, but they rotated shifts with him, so he was the one who often spent hours alone in the dark, empty corridors. The hospital had a reputation. It was an old building, full of creaky floors and flickering lights, a place where the history of past lives seemed to hang in the air. There were rumors, whispers from the staff and even from some of the patients. They spoke of things they couldn't explain. Strange noises, things seen out of the corner of their eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But for Anthony, it was all just superstition. He had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. He was practical, logical, and viewed his job as just another way to pay the bills. Tonight, however, something felt off. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could describe, but it lingered in the back of his mind as he grabbed his security clipboard and made his rounds. The air inside the hospital seemed unnaturally cold for a spring night, and the light fixtures overhead flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that danced across the walls. He told himself it was nothing, a malfunction perhaps, and he carried on. He walked the familiar path through the lobby, past the nurses' station where no one was working at this hour. The place was empty, just the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The hospital seemed alive, but only in the most unsettling ways, like an organism that breathed, groaned, and shifted in the dark. He passed the emergency room doors, where the faint glow of the light inside reflected on the tile floor. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and his thoughts turned to the patients he'd seen in passing earlier: old men, women clinging to life, and those with no family to speak of. The hospital was a place where life and death collided, and sometimes, Anthony thought, those on the brink never really left. He sat at the security desk for a while, sipping on his stale coffee, his eyes scanning the monitors. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching into the next. The stillness was punctuated only by the occasional report over the intercom or the shuffle of nurses in the hallway. For all its unsettling history, the hospital at night was an empty shell, devoid of warmth, life, and comfort. It was a place where the dead seemed to linger, unseen but always present in some subtle way. A sudden sharp noise brought Anthony out of his thoughts. It was a loud bang, echoing from somewhere far down the hallway, deep in the west wing. He froze, his heart rate spiking. The hallway was empty. He checked the cameras. Nothing. No one had entered or exited the building for hours. His eyes returned to the monitor, but the silence seemed unnaturally thick. The lights flickered again. Then he heard it, soft footsteps echoing from the hallway, like someone walking slowly, deliberately. Anthony glanced at the camera feed, but found no one. The hallway, as always, was empty. It was then that he felt it. A subtle pressure in the air, a sense of being watched. It was fleeting, but it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He pushed it aside. "You're just tired, Anthony," he muttered to himself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." He stood up from his chair, trying to shake off the unease, but it lingered, like a fog in his mind. The next hour passed without incident, or so it seemed. Anthony's shift continued in much the same way as it always did, but the atmosphere in St. Vincent's Hospital felt undeniably strange that night. The air grew colder, and a heaviness settled over the building. He chalked it up to the creeping dread that often followed him during late-night shifts. The longer you were alone in a place like this, the more your mind could play tricks on you. The stories, the legends of the haunted hospital, all seemed to crawl to the surface of his mind. But Anthony quickly pushed them away, reminding himself that he was a rational person, not one to fall for old superstitions. Still, as he walked through the hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small, just little things at first. The overhead lights flickered more persistently than usual, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The constant hum of the hospital's ventilation system was muffled by the silence, making the building feel even more isolated and distant. His footsteps echoed louder than they should, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than normal. But he dismissed it all. It wasn't until he reached the far wing of the hospital that things began to feel unsettling. The sounds started. First, a soft creak, a groan, as if the building itself were shifting and settling. Then, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking just out of sight. Anthony immediately glanced up at the security camera feed. The monitors displayed an empty hallway, no one in sight. The footsteps continued, though, just beyond the camera's range. They were too precise to be random. Something was walking down the hall at steps measured and controlled. Curious, Anthony leaned forward in his chair, his heart beginning to race. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, the beam of light sweeping across the hallway in front of him. As he moved down the corridor, the footsteps seemed to match his pace, never speeding up or slowing down. It was as though he was being followed by a ghost, or perhaps something even worse. His stomach twisted in discomfort, but he told himself it was nothing. Maybe it was a patient wandering the halls or a staff member who had forgotten to clock out. He turned the corner into the next hallway, the steps following just behind him. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps that moved at a constant pace, but no one was there. He froze, listening intently. The only thing he could hear was the distant hum of the building's pipes and the faint clicking of the overhead lights. He turned back toward the hallway, but when he looked down the long, empty corridor, there was nothing. His heart pounded in his chest. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound was coming from somewhere else, perhaps the building's infrastructure. The older parts of the hospital were known for making strange noises, especially at night when the air grew colder. But Anthony couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He resumed walking, more cautiously this time. The echoes of his footsteps filled the silence, but the feeling of being followed never left. Every few steps, the sound of those mysterious footsteps would resume, as if they were stalking him, keeping pace with his every move. They were never close enough for him to pinpoint their exact source, yet they seemed just behind him, too close to be ignored. He reached the elevator bank and paused, his hand resting on the cold metal railing. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, sharper, almost like they were tapping against the floor. Closer now. Panic set in. There was no one in sight. He swung his flashlight around wildly, illuminating every corner, every shadow. The beam danced. Across the walls, the light catching on someone, just at the edge of the hallway. But when he turned, there was no one there. His breath quickened, and his mind began to race. Was he going crazy? His heart was pounding in his ears, and the unsettling silence of the hospital felt even more oppressive now. The footsteps stopped, leaving nothing but the thumping of his own heartbeat to fill the void. He spun around quickly, only to find the hallway empty. No figures, no patients wandering about. Just the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights above him. He turned back toward the elevator bank and hesitated. His mind was on high alert now. He was certain he had heard those footsteps, and yet the building remained as eerily quiet as ever. With a sigh, Anthony shook his head, trying to steady his nerves. It's just the darkness playing tricks on you, he told himself. You're alone. It's been a long shift and you're tired. You're hearing things that aren't there. As the night dragged on, Anthony's unease only grew. The feeling that something wasn't right, something unseen lurking in the shadows clung to him like a second skin. His flashlight flickered and dimmed for a moment, forcing him to replace the batteries. As he did, the radio crackled to life, the sudden noise causing him to jump in surprise. "Anthony, are you there?" The voice on the other end sounded distorted, broken by static. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it felt urgent, like a warning. "Who is this?" Anthony responded, his voice more strained than he intended. He looked around the security booth, trying to shake off the sense that he was no longer alone. There was a pause before the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "Anthony, it's too late. They're coming for you. You shouldn't be here." Anthony's hand gripped the radio tighter, his heart racing. "What do you mean? Who is this? Is someone playing a prank?" But the transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static behind. He tried to respond, but there was no answer. Silence. Then the air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. "Anthony. Anthony." It was as if the words were coming from all directions surrounding him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He checked the monitors again, looking for something, anything, that could explain what he was hearing. But once again, the hallway on the screen was empty. He stared at the screen, his breath shallow, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate. In the corner of his eye, a figure moved. He whipped his head toward the hallway, but saw nothing. His pulse quickened, and his breath quickened as he scanned the shadows. That's when he saw it. An unnatural shift in the darkness at the far end of the hall, a shape that wasn't quite right. The figure emerged from the shadows, pale, gaunt, and wearing a hospital gown. Its eyes were hollow, dark sockets where the life once was. The thing smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was twisted, grotesque, like a mask of malice. "Anthony," it whispered, its voice a dry rasp. "You shouldn't have come." Anthony stumbled back in terror, but the figure was gone before he could react, vanishing into the shadows. His mind screamed at him to run, to leave, but he stood frozen, heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't just a trick of the light. He had seen it. He had seen her. Suddenly, the air in the hallway shifted, becoming oppressive, thick, with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The whispers returned, more frantic this time. They filled the space, bouncing off the walls, swirling around him. "We never leave," they chanted, their voices growing louder, merging into a single, chilling phrase. Anthony felt the walls close in on him. His legs felt heavy, as if they were made of stone. The shadows stretched unnaturally long. It felt like the hospital itself was alive, breathing, watching. He could hear the steady thrum of his heart, but it was drowned out by the screams that echoed from every corner, from every room. The radio crackled again. This time the voice on the other end wasn't a distorted whisper. It was clear, and it was unmistakable. "Anthony, help. Help me." The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. Anthony felt his stomach churn. He recognized it. It was the voice of a patient who had been admitted just a few days ago. A young woman, admitted with severe injuries after a car crash. She had died on the operating table, though no one had expected her to survive. Anthony had been there when the doctors tried to save her, but they hadn't been able to. The air in the room grew even colder, and he could see his breath now, visible in the freezing temperature. He wanted to scream, to run, but the shadowy figure was back. This time there were more of them. Pale figures in hospital gowns, their faces contorted in expressions. One of them reached out for him, its fingers cold as ice. His body was paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. He could barely breathe, barely think, but as the figure drew closer, Anthony realized one terrible truth. There was no escape. Anthony's eyes darted from one figure to the next, his body stiff with terror. The pale, gaunt forms moved toward him with unnatural precision, their footsteps silent, their faces blank slates of suffering. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as he realized the truth. He was trapped. The hospital, once a place of care, had turned into a labyrinth of nightmares. The whispers grew louder, blending into one continuous wail of despair. He could no longer discern where the sounds were coming from. They surrounded him, filled his mind, became his reality. In the midst of this disorienting chaos, one of the figures stepped forward. It was the woman in white, her eyes hollow, her smile grotesque. "You shouldn't be here, Anthony," she whispered again, her voice as cold as the grave. "You'll never leave." Suddenly, her image flickered, like a malfunctioning TV screen, and she vanished. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide as he struggled to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. He stumbled backward, desperately trying to regain control of his body, his mind. He turned on his heel and ran, heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the same sterile white walls that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating. He rounded corners, desperately searching for an exit, any way to escape. But the hospital had become a maze. Every turn led him to the same place. The air grew colder with every step, his breath now visible in the freezing air. His footsteps echoed loudly, as though the hospital itself were responding to his frantic movements. The whispers were getting closer now, following him, their voices overlapping, growing louder and more frantic. His flashlight flickered as he moved, casting fleeting glimmers of light on the walls before plunging him back into darkness. He stopped in front of a door, the faintest light shining beneath it. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. What he found inside made his blood run cold. The room was empty save for a single bed, still made up with fresh sheets. But the bed wasn't the most terrifying part. The walls were covered in blood, dark smudged handprints smeared across the sterile white. And at the foot of the bed, the floor was soaked in a dark, sticky substance that Anthony instantly recognized. Blood. It wasn't just any blood, though. It was the blood of a patient. The blood of someone who had been in this very room. The whispers became frantic, desperate, as if they were urging him to look closer. As his eyes locked onto the blood-stained floor, his stomach churned. There, partially hidden beneath the bed, was something. Someone. A body. It was the body of the woman he had seen earlier, her lifeless eyes staring up at him. And from her lips a single hoarse word slipped through the silence. "Help!" Anthony recoiled in horror, but as he turned to run, the door slammed shut behind him. He was trapped, and the whispers were closing in. Anthony's heart raced as he stumbled backward from the bloody scene. His mind was overwhelmed by the images, the cold, lifeless eyes of the woman beneath the bed, the unrelenting whispers, the sense that something far darker had taken hold of the hospital. His body screamed at him to leave, to escape, but his legs felt heavy like they were made of stone. The cold air grew colder still, biting at his skin as he backed away from the bed, his breath shallow, his thoughts a blur of panic and fear. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, trapping him inside the room. His heart skipped a beat and he darted toward the door, trying to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder against it again and again, but it felt as though the door was made of solid iron. There was no way out. He was trapped. And the whispers were closing in. "You can't leave, Anthony," they taunted, their voices dripping with malice. "You're already one of us." Desperation set in. His mind raced for an escape, for some way to break free of the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. He turned, scanning the room for something, anything, that could help him. The cold walls offered no solace, and the blood-stained floor reflected the dim light of his flickering flashlight. His mind's eye flashed to the woman's final plea, the word that haunted him: help. He had to do something. He had to help. A cold, searing pain suddenly shot through his chest, and he gasped, clutching his ribs as a sharp breath escaped him. Something was in him. Something was feeding off his fear, his terror. It crawled under his skin, wrapping around his heart, tightening like a vice. His vision blurred, and he stumbled forward, dropping to his knees. Suddenly, the air shifted, the temperature plummeted even further, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They surrounded him, drowning out everything else. "You never should have come. You should have known. The spirits will never let you go." He could feel them now. The spirits. The restless souls that had been trapped here. The ones who had died, left to haunt these halls. And they were angry. They were hungry. The woman in white reappeared, but this time she was different. Her face was contorted in agony, her eyes wide and unblinking. She stepped forward, her feet gliding across the floor as though she was floating, her form flickering in and out like a dying flame. She reached out, her cold hand grazing his cheek. "You are ours now," she whispered, her voice as soft and chilling as a breeze. Anthony tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth was dry and his body was paralyzed by the overwhelming cold. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, and the floor beneath him began to warp, as if the hospital itself was twisting, folding, warping into something more sinister. The walls stretched, the doors became thin as paper, and the windows melted into nothing. The spirits were closing in. He was suffocating in their presence, unable to escape. He could feel their cold fingers on his skin, their cries in his ears, their dead eyes staring at him from every corner. "You should have left," the woman whispered again, her face now inches from his own. "You should have listened." With one final desperate gasp, Anthony lunged for the door again, his hand shaking as he gripped the cold metal handle. And for the briefest moment the door opened. But as he stepped through, he was no longer in the hospital. He was somewhere else, a place devoid of light, where the spirits of the hospital's victims waited. "You are one of us now." The voice of the woman echoed in his ears as the darkness closed in around him, and then there was nothing.